Comrades, it's a great honor for me that I have been asked to speak at this seminar to inaugurate it. A seminar which is being held in order to herald the CPIM's state conference. This conference is being held at a time which is very crucial for the country because we face the threat of neo-fascism. Before I say anything about center-state relations as such, I would like to point out that when we discuss center-state relations today, the context is different. The center-state relations that we discuss today is different in one sense from the center-state relations that we discussed, let us say, 20 years ago or 30 years ago. This difference in context arises from the fact that all over the world there is an emergence of a very strong right-wing movement. Everywhere in the world there is an upsurge of the right. This is not just the ordinary right that we are familiar with from the 1950s and 60s. This is in fact a fascistic right, a neo-fascist right, which is reminiscent of 1930s fascism. There are a number of common features, at least 6 common features between the current neo-fascist upsurge and the fascism of the 1930s. The first, of course, is extreme state repression. Now, this is something which all of us are familiar with, and this is something which people have been writing about. A student of my university, Umar Khalid, has been in jail for 4.5 years with no bail, no trial, not even a charge sheet being given to him. So you can imagine the kind of repression that can be let loose on anybody, whoever is a critic of the state, of the government, whoever is a critic who is an intellectual or an artist or, of course, political opponent. The second feature which you find today, not just in India, but in a number of countries, is the fact that this state repression is combined with the street attack by youth belonging to the fascist groups. I know again in my university, the ABVP goes around attacking students. Nothing happens to them. They go around attacking students. This is something which is reminiscent of the Balailas of Mussolini's time, which actually, had the fascist youths going around attacking people. So state repression is combined with repression on the streets. The third feature, of course, is the targeting of a minority community. It's a minority community that can be either immigrants, it can be a religious minority like in our country, or it can be an ethnic minority. But the targeting of a minority community and the invoking of hatred within the majority for this minority is another feature which again we find in many countries, including ours. The fourth feature, of course, is a very close nexus between monopoly capital on the one hand and these fascist formations, fascist political formations on the other hand. The next feature, which is again very important, is that within monopoly capital, there is a particular segment of new monopoly capital consisting of the Adanis and so on, who actually are particularly close to the fascist groups. In Germany, it was a new group of monopoly capital which was more in producer goods industry, the armaments and so on, as distinct from the old monopoly capital that was in textiles and consumer goods and so on, which was particularly close to the Nazi party. In Japan, there was a new zaibatsu called the Shinko zaibatsu, like Nissan and so on, who are particularly close to the military fascists compared to the old Zaibatsu, Mitsui and others. So the next feature, which is that there is the cult of the leader, that basically power resides not with the people, power emanates from the leader. And because power emanates from the leader, and the leader speaks in the name of a metaphysical concept of the people, not people as they really are, but a metaphysical concept of the people. So the cult of the leader is something which is common again to all these fascisms, including what you find today. These features are very similar to what you found in the 1930s. And what is more, they are really spread all over the world. There is Milei in Argentina, there is Trump in the United States, there is Modi in India, there is Erdogan in Turkey, there is Orban in Hungary, there is Meloni in Italy, there is, in some countries where they have not come to power, they're very close to power, like, for instance, Marine Le Pen in France, AfD in Germany. So all over the world, you actually have the emergence of fascism. And why this emergence? The fundamental reason is that there is a crisis of neoliberal capitalism. Neoliberal capitalism generates extreme inequality. It gives rise to a fantastic increase in inequality, and whenever that happens, basically there is, if you like, a redistribution of income from the poor to the rich. Because the poor consume a lot of their proportion of their income compared to the rich, any such redistribution gives rise to a reduction in consumption and therefore an overproduction crisis, which is what we witness today. Whenever there is a crisis, monopoly capital actually turns to support from neo-fascist or fascist groups. Fascist groups exist in all modern society, but usually in the fringes of society, in the fringes of the polity. They are, as it were, minor players. But on the other hand, in a period of crisis, when the hegemony of monopoly capital becomes threatened, monopoly capital makes common cause with all these fascist elements. It gives them support, financial support and media support, media controlled by monopoly capital, in order to bring them center stage. And why do they do that? Because they give rise to a change in discourse. The discourse is no longer about the crisis, about unemployment, about food price inflation, about malnutrition, but the discourse becomes about a temple. That India's independence began when they inaugurated a temple. So the discourse then shifts completely from material facts of life to these kinds of things, where naturally the hegemony of monopoly capital is not challenged. And of course, any such division which divides the working people, divides the workers, divides the people generally, is a damper on the ability of the people to question the hegemony of monopoly capital. If they are divided, then they cannot. Therefore, you have, in a period of crisis, as Comrade Dimitrov had mentioned in the 7th Congress of the Comintern, you actually, in a period of crisis, you have the emergence of fascism and the emergence of a monopoly fascist alliance. Today, what you have is an emergence of a neoliberal, neo-fascist alliance, which in our country takes the form of a corporate Hindutva alliance. Now, this corporate Hindutva alliance is what actually has hegemony today in the polity. Now, this is where, as I was saying, the corporates, that means monopoly capital, is interested in centralization. Monopoly capital wants the resources to be centralized so that these centralized resources can then be placed at the disposal of monopoly capital. So monopoly capital is always in favor of centralization. At the same time, the Hindutva groups are also in favor of centralization because they are, as I said, they promote the cult of the leader, and therefore, since power emanates from the leader, wisdom emanates from the leader must be given the maximum amount of respect, power, privilege, and therefore concentration of resources at his disposal. Therefore, the very nature of Hindutva fascism is actually to concentrate power in the hands of the leader. So monopoly capital wants centralization. The fascist groups, neo-fascist groups want centralization, because of which there is a tendency towards centralization today, which is really absolutely strong and striking. It is in this sense that I am saying that center-state relations today are not the same as center-state relations were, let us say, 30 years ago. It is no longer a fight about the center getting a bit more resources, states getting a bit less resources. It is really a fight for a complete centralization of power in the polity, reducing the states to the level of minor municipalities, with the center taking the major decisions. It is this which therefore today confronts us. Obviously, the most significant manifestation of this is in the realm of centralization of resources. I would not go into great details about centralization of resources, but to say that one phenomenon that has actually helped this centralization is the introduction of GST, goods and services tax, for the old sales tax. The Constitution had actually laid down the taxes which the center can levy, it had laid down the taxes which the state can levy, and the Constitution had found that actually the state taxes would not give as much revenue to the states as their responsibilities demanded. The states had various tasks to perform, the resources they get would not be enough, and therefore they set the stage for the formation of a finance commission, as Comrade Harilal was explaining, which would then adjudicate a part of the central revenue which accrues to the center would have to be distributed to the states. No, but the point is that where the states can raise taxes was clearly specified in the Constitution. And of course, the most significant of these taxes was the sales tax. Almost 80% of the resources of states came from sales tax. Now, a peculiar argument started being presented, which was a completely bogus argument, namely that unless you actually have a goods and services tax where the tax rate across all the states is exactly the same for every commodity, maybe the tax rates would differ from one group of commodities to another. But for any group of commodities, the same tax rate has to be levied across all the states. If that does not happen, if you don't have a uniform GST for every commodity, in that case, the national market does not get unified. Now, this was a completely bogus argument. The biggest capitalist country in the world, the United States, actually has different states levying different rates of taxes. Nobody is going to argue that the United States does not have a uniform market. Nobody is going to argue that the United States is not a state, is not a country where capitalism has not developed. And therefore, to use this argument about a uniform rate is something which was really a red herring. But this argument, which is part of the neoliberal thrust, this argument was presented And of course, it was assiduously promoted, because of which the sales tax was substituted by the GST. States wouldn't have agreed to this substitution. They agreed to it because of a promise which was made by the central government, namely that you are going to get compensation. We shall assume that your base period revenue would grow at 14%, and any shortfall in your revenue because of GST from this 14% growth is something which we are going to make good through a GST compensation for 5 years. It is that promise which persuaded many states that, okay, they are saying that, uniform taxation across for each commodity is something which is good. And what is more, we are going to get revenue for compensation for 5 years. So let's go ahead with it. Therefore, many states accepted it. But when they accepted it, it turned out that actually the compensation of 14% was never really fulfilled. Even now, the compensation that Kerala gets for GST this year is less than what it had got last year, let alone 14%. So the point is that you have a promise made, the promise was violated. But let's even forget about the violation of the promise. Let's just see what has been happening. If you take all the tax revenue of the states, particularly sales tax and also a few other taxes that were substituted by the GST, if you take the revenue from all those taxes in the pre-GST period, and you take the revenue from the GST that the states get along with the central compensation, GST compensation, the total revenue in the post-GST period, its rate of growth is lower for all states taken together than in the pre-GST period. What is more, obviously in the post-GST period, the GDP growth rate, the gross domestic product, gross state domestic product growth rate has slowed down. So you may say that, all right, GDP has slowed down, what can we do, etc. You take the percentage of revenue to GSDP in the post-GST period, and you take the percentage of revenue to GSDP in the pre-GST period, you find that there is a fall in the post-GST period, taking all states together. So, the point is that the GST has affected the states very badly. It has affected not only in terms of a loss of revenue, but it has affected also in terms of taking away their freedom to charge the rates that they would like to charge. If it is the case that a state finds itself in revenue difficulties, then that state earlier had the power to raise the tax on particular goods. That power no longer exists. It now exists with a thing called the GST Council, where all states are represented and including the center represented, and unless there is a decision of the GST Council that Kerala can raise its GST rate on some commodity, the finance minister of Kerala will not be allowed to do that. It is this, the loss of power of the states, quite apart from the loss of revenue, which is really a very significant tinkering with the Indian Constitution. It actually takes away the rights of states, and it does so in a manner which is really unwarranted. It is something which is based on an argument which lacks any basis. And that's as far as resources are concerned. But exactly the same is true also in terms of the realm of the polity. Earlier, the governors of states were actually people who were nominal, titular heads. And therefore, they went around inaugurating things. They went around being kind of figureheads. Only if the government fell, that the governor had some kind of a role. Otherwise, the governors did not really have any role. Whenever an occasion arose where they had to go and give a speech, formal speech. They gave the point of view of the state government. Therefore, the state government would prepare their speech and they would deliver that speech. Now what has happened is the governors have really become powerful beings. They are nominees of the center. Typically, they are people belonging to the RSS or people who are pliant bureaucrats. Now, these people, or allies of the RSS, allies of the BJP, these people who are unelected, who are handpicked by the center to head various states as governors, are now asserting their rights and saying that no, in fact, decisions have to be taken in consultation with them. They are asserting a superiority over the elected governments of the states, which is actually diminishing the power of the state governments, the power of the state legislatures, and therefore the power of the people of the state. And therefore you find that the governors have started interfering, Tamil Nadu, Kerala, West Bengal, everywhere. The governors, particularly against opposition-ruled states, the governors have started interfering and thereby reducing the reach and the scope of the elected governments. And what is more, this has particularly become significant in the sphere of education, because the corporate Hindutva alliance is aware of the fact that criticism against its hegemony would really arise from centers of education. It's people who are sensitive to the situation, people who are educated, people who are critical, people who are thinkers are the ones who are going to say, what is all this you're doing? And therefore the whole idea is to destroy the independence of the educational institutions. And towards that end, the governors have been used to destroy the universities in various places. And now the UGC, University Grants Commission, which is also a central body, is being used to destroy universities. The UGC has come out with a set of guidelines, and those guidelines basically imply that once they are accepted, in every university in the country, including state universities, which are primarily funded by the state government, in every university in the country, it is the central government who is going to appoint the vice-chancellor. Now, this basically implies that the center would be running all universities, including the state universities. Not only does it abridge the autonomy of the university system, not only does it abridge the power of the states, but what is more, it actually gives the center the power to decide basically what the nature of these universities is going to be, and thereby to prevent these oases of critical thought, which is so worrying for them. And of course, also the UGC guidelines say that you can now have industrialists, you can have bureaucrats, pliant bureaucrats who can be vice-chancellors of these various universities. So you have the corporate Hindutva attempt to take over centers of thought, to destroy any critical thought, and to destroy, therefore, any challenge to their hegemony by taking over the universities. Therefore, this is centralization of a kind which is really quite different from the centralization that was happening earlier, against which everybody had, on the left, had actually raised his or her voice. Now, this is, however, not just a centralization we should be worried about because of resources and so on. This centralization would destroy the unity of the country. A very well-known Marxist scholar, Professor Ramalindu Guha of Assam, had once written that everybody in India actually has a dual national consciousness, that everybody has a regional linguistic nationality consciousness of being a Tamil, of being a Keralite, of being an Odia, of being a Bengali, of being a Gujarati. That is one kind of consciousness that everybody has. But the other is a kind of pan-Indian consciousness. We feel happy if India does well. So there is a pan-Indian consciousness as well as a regional linguistic consciousness. Everybody has this dual national consciousness. Now, of course, then he had argued that if you push one of these at the expense of the other, then you would have disastrous consequences. He was, of course, talking about the Assam agitation of the 1980s, when Mrs. Indira Gandhi had tried to push the pan-Indian consciousness at the expense of the regional linguistic consciousness, the reaction to which was the Assam agitation. But that is something which is going to repeat itself. The more you have the pushing of the overarching, not even pan-Indian, overarching centralized Hindutva consciousness, the more you would find that there would be a revolt against it, and it will become very difficult for the country to stick together if this actually happens. Therefore, centralization has dangers inherent in it, and these people, the Hindutva crowd, is unaware of these dangers. The corporate Hindutva alliance is unaware of these dangers. But these are dangers that we have to keep in mind. And that is why what is happening today is really extremely serious. And the center-state relations is really a part of this effort to centralize. You had exactly the same effort to centralize in Hitler's Germany. You had exactly the same effort to centralize in Mussolini's Italy, where actually states, provinces had really been reduced to a very minor role, and the center had acquired an overarching role. This is the tendency of all fascism, and it is actually something which follows, as I said, from the fact that in fascism, power emanates from the leader. And therefore, where the leader is, where the power should be, and that is why there is a centralization of power and hence resources in the location where the leader happens to be placed. And that is what is being repeated here, and that, as I said, has extremely dangerous consequences. We have to be aware of this, and we have to fight this, that the anti-neo-fascist struggle, the struggle against the corporate Hindutva alliance must be something that incorporates the struggle for states' rights, the struggle for the ability of the state governments to manage not only their affairs and resources, their power should not be diminished, but what is more, also to make sure that they are not deprived of their right to have universities the way they want. University autonomy is actually guaranteed by the act which was, suppose you have Kerala University. Kerala University is set up by a legislation of the Kerala Assembly. Central universities like JNU, to which I belong, are set up by a legislation in the parliament. Now, these legislations actually have priority. The University Grants Commission does not have any reason to interfere. It is not allowed any scope to interfere. It is something which is supposed to coordinate among various universities, supposed to provide finance to universities, supposed to provide that certain minimum standards are maintained, but the universities are governed by their statutes. The statutes of Kerala University are made available by the government of Kerala. And the government of Kerala does so because of a legislation of Kerala Assembly. The legislation empowers the government to do so. Therefore, what the UGC is doing is interfering in the constitutional rights of the states. What GST did was to interfere with the constitutional rights of the states. What the governors are doing is interfering in the constitutional rights of the state legislatures. Therefore, as I said, this centralization is one which is actually interfering in the constitutional rights of states, changing India from a federal polity to a centralized polity. And this, as I said, has to be resisted. Thank you very much.